What happens when one of the most beloved musicians in history sits down for what should be a simple morning chat, only to face a barrage of personal attacks and disrespect that crosses every line imaginable. It only took 39 seconds of pure condescension for a television host to destroy her own career and send a legend walking off her set in disgust. The studio lights were bright that morning. Paul McCartney walked onto the set with that familiar smile, the one that had charmed millions for decades. He was there to talk about his latest project, a documentary celebrating his musical journey. It was supposed to be light, fun, nostalgic. Lorraine Kelly sat across from him, her notes spread out on the small coffee table between them. And as the cameras began rolling, everything seemed perfectly normal. "Paul, welcome to the show," Lorraine said, her voice carrying that practiced cheerfulness that morning television hosts perfect over years of practice. "Thank you for having me," Paul replied, settling into his chair. "It's lovely to be here. So, let's talk about this documentary of yours," Lorraine continued, glancing at her notes. "You've had quite the career, haven't you? Though, I have to say, some people might wonder if you're just trying to stay relevant at this point." There was a brief pause. Paul's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Well, I suppose I'm just doing what I've always done, making music and sharing it with people who want to listen." Lorraine leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs. "Right. But you're in your 80s now? Don't you think it's time to let the younger generation have their moment? I mean, how many times can you tour the same songs?" The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the warm, fuzzy interview they'd expected. Paul maintained his composure, though his jaw tightened just a fraction. "I tour because people still want to hear the music. The shows sell out. Fans from all generations come together, and that's something really special. Sell out. Come on now," Lorraine said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Let's be honest, people are coming for nostalgia, not because you're doing anything new or groundbreaking. You've been riding on the coattails of the Beatles for 60 years now." Paul took a slow breath. "The Beatles were a collaboration, a partnership. What we created together was special, but I've also had a successful solo career, worked with Wings, experimented with different genres. I've never stopped creating." Lorraine laughed, but it wasn't a warm laugh. It was sharp, cutting. "Successful solo career? That's generous. Without John Lennon, would anyone really care about what you were doing? Let's face it, he was the real genius of the group." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Paul's eyes narrowed slightly, but he kept his voice steady. "John was incredibly talented, and I miss him every day. But we wrote together. We inspired each other. It wasn't about one person being better than another." "Oh, please," Lorraine interrupted, flipping through her notes dramatically. "Everyone knows John was the creative force. You were just the pretty face who played the bass. And not even that well, if we're being completely honest." Members of the crew exchanged shocked glances. This had gone beyond provocative questioning into something else entirely. Something ugly. Paul straightened in his chair, his expression hardening. "I think you're being incredibly disrespectful, not just to me, but to the legacy of the band and to John's memory." Lorraine waved her hand again, as if swatting away his objection. "Disrespectful? I'm just asking the questions everyone's thinking. You've made millions, probably billions, off songs that were written when you were young. Now you're just an old man clinging to past glory. Don't you have any shame about that?" "Shame?" Paul repeated, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm proud of everything I've accomplished. I've worked hard my entire life, and I've never taken for granted the connection I have with people through music." "But that's just it," Lorraine pressed on, leaning forward now, her voice dripping with condescension. "You haven't really worked, have you? You stumbled into success as a young man, had everything handed to you, and now you just collect checks from the same old songs. Real artists evolve. They grow. They challenge themselves. You just play yesterday for the millionth time and call it a career." Paul's hands gripped the armrest of his chair. "I've written hundreds of songs. I've explored classical music, electronic music, collaborated with artists across every genre. If you'd done even basic research, you'd know that." Lorraine smirked. "Oh, I did my research, Paul. I know all about your little vanity projects, the classical albums that nobody listened to, the experimental stuff that went nowhere. It's all just desperation, isn't it? Trying to prove you're more than just the guy who got lucky in a band 60 years ago." "Lucky?" Paul's voice rose slightly. "You think it was luck? We practiced for hours every day, played tiny clubs in Hamburg, worked ourselves to exhaustion to get where we were. Luck had nothing to do with it." Sure," Lorraine said, examining her nails as if bored. But let's talk about your personal life, shall we? 3 marriages, was it? 4. I lose count. That's not exactly the behavior of someone with good judgment. Paul's face flushed. My personal relationships are none of your business, and they have nothing to do with why I'm here today. Everything's my business when you sit in that chair, Lorraine shot back. You're a public figure. You've made yourself a commodity. And frankly, the public has a right to know that behind all the nice guy image, you're just another celebrity who can't keep a marriage together. I've loved and lost like many people, Paul said, his voice tight. I've also found happiness. But again, this has nothing to do with the documentary. Lorraine laughed that cutting laugh again. The documentary, right? A vanity project where you get to rewrite history and make yourself look like the hero of every story. Did you pay people to say nice things about you? Because I can't imagine anyone genuinely thinking you're as important as you seem to think you are. Paul stood up abruptly, his microphone pack tangling slightly. I've had enough of this. I came here for a professional interview, not to be insulted and attacked. Oh, sit down, Lorraine said dismissively. Don't be such a baby. Can't handle a few tough questions? That's pathetic. These aren't tough questions, Paul said, his voice shaking with controlled anger. This is just cruelty disguised as journalism. You're not interested in the truth. You're interested in tearing someone down for ratings. Lorraine stood as well, her face twisted with indignation. How dare you question my journalistic integrity? I've been doing this for years. I've interviewed prime ministers, movie stars, actual important people. You're just a has-been musician who should be grateful I even agreed to have you on my show. Grateful? Paul repeated, incredulous. You should be grateful. I've given decades of joy to millions of people around the world. I've contributed to culture, to art, to bringing people together. What have you done besides sit in a chair and belittle your guests? The crew had stopped pretending to work. Everyone was frozen, watching this confrontation unfold. Lorraine's face turned red. Get out. Get out of my studio right now. I'm already leaving, Paul said, pulling off his microphone pack and dropping it on the chair. I don't need to subject myself to this kind of treatment. I've faced actual challenges in my life, real hardships, and I'm not going to stand here and let you talk to me like I'm nothing. You are nothing without the Beatles, Lorraine shouted after him. You're a footnote in music history pretending to be a legend. Paul stopped at the edge of the set and turned back. You know what the saddest part of all this is? You could have had a lovely conversation. You could have asked about the documentary, about the stories behind the songs, about the incredible people I've worked with. Instead, you chose to be mean-spirited and small. That says everything about you and nothing about me. Don't you dare lecture me, Lorraine snapped. I built this show from nothing. I earned my place here. And you've just thrown it all away, Paul said quietly. Because this right here, this is what people will remember. Not your years of work, not your other interviews, just this moment where you forgot basic human decency. Lorraine crossed her arms. The public will side with me. They'll see you for the entitled celebrity you really are, walking off when things get a little challenging. Challenging? Paul shook his head. You called my life's work worthless. You mocked my marriages, my age, my talent. You've shown nothing but contempt from the moment I sat down. If you think that's challenging journalism, you're deluded. Get security. Lorraine called out to someone off camera. Escort this man out. I'm going, Paul said. I don't need an escort. I know my way out. He paused, taking one last look at Lorraine. I genuinely hope you think about what happened here today, because you've hurt yourself far more than you could ever hurt me. With that, he walked off the set. The studio fell into stunned silence. Lorraine stood there, her chest heaving, clearly expecting someone to support her, to agree that she'd been right. But the crew members were looking at her with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. What? She demanded. What are you all staring at? Get back to work. We need to fill the segment. Nobody moved. The producer, a woman in her 50s who'd worked in television for decades, stepped forward. Lorraine, that was completely out of line. Out of line? Lorraine's voice pitched higher. I was doing my job. I was asking the hard questions that nobody else has the courage to ask. You were bullying a guest, the producer said flatly. There's a difference between tough questioning and personal attacks. You crossed that line about 5 minutes into the interview. He's a public figure, Lorraine protested. He can handle it. Being a public figure doesn't mean you forfeit basic respect, the producer replied. And even if it did, what you said wasn't journalism. It was just mean. Lorraine looked around the studio, searching for an ally. Someone agree with me here. I can't be the only one who thinks Paul McCartney is overrated. More silence. Finally, one of the cameramen spoke up. My mom loves Paul McCartney. She's going to be devastated when she hears about this. Oh, for heaven's sake, Lorraine muttered. It's just Paul McCartney. There are plenty of other musicians in the world. Not like him, the cameraman said quietly. He's special, and you treated him like garbage. Lorraine spun to face the producer. Are we going to air this or not? The producer was already on her phone. I'm talking to the network now. But Lorraine, I'll be honest with you, this is bad. Really bad. It's just one interview, Lorraine said, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. It'll blow over. You called Paul McCartney talentless, the producer said, looking up from her phone. You mocked his marriages, his age, and suggested he was only successful because of John Lennon. Do you really think that's going to blow over? For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Lorraine's face. I was just trying to make good television. People love drama. There's drama, and then there's watching someone be unnecessarily cruel to a beloved figure, the producer said. You've been doing this long enough to know the difference. Lorraine sank back into her chair, the reality of what had happened beginning to dawn on her. He provoked me. Did you see how he was looking at me? He was looking at you like someone who couldn't believe what he was hearing, the producer said. And honestly, neither could I. What were you thinking? I thought. Lorraine began, then stopped. I thought it would make me look tough, like a real journalist who doesn't coddle celebrities. Instead, you look like a bully, the producer said bluntly. And the network is already getting calls. Someone in the audience must have tweeted about it. Lorraine's hands started to shake. What kind of calls? Complaints. Lots of them. And that's just in the last 5 minutes, from the live audience members who had their phones. The producer's phone buzzed again. We're pulling the segment. It won't air. You can't do that, Lorraine protested. That's my show. And it's the network's reputation, the producer countered. They're not going to broadcast footage of you attacking Paul McCartney. The backlash would be enormous. Lorraine stood up again, pacing now. This is ridiculous. I've had controversial interviews before. Nobody made this big a deal about it. Because those interviews were with people who actually deserve tough questioning, the producer said. Politicians who'd been caught in scandals, celebrities accused of wrongdoing. Paul McCartney came here to talk about a documentary about his music career. There was no scandal, no controversy, nothing that warranted what you did. So what happens now? Lorraine asked, her voice smaller. The producer looked at her phone again, reading a new message. The network wants to see you immediately. Lorraine felt her stomach drop. They're going to fire me, aren't they? I don't know, the producer said. But I wouldn't want to be in your position right now. She paused. For what it's worth, Lorraine, you're a talented broadcaster. You've done great work over the years, but today you forgot the basic rule of interviewing. Treat your guests with respect, even when you're asking difficult questions. Especially then. I just wanted to be memorable, Lorraine said quietly. Well, you succeeded, the producer replied. But not in the way you wanted. The studio began to clear out, crew members gathering their equipment, everyone avoiding eye contact with Lorraine. She stood alone in the middle of the set, the bright lights still shining down on her, illuminating the empty chair where Paul McCartney had sat just minutes before. This was supposed to be a good day, she whispered to no one in particular. But it wasn't. It was the day Lorraine Kelly let her ego and her need for sensationalism override her professionalism. It was the day she mistook cruelty for courage, and paid the price for it. And as she walked slowly toward the exit, heading to face the network executives, she couldn't help but replay the interview in her mind, seeing now, too late, all the moments where she could have made a different choice. Paul McCartney, meanwhile, had left the building. He'd been ushered out by apologetic staff members, people who'd grown up listening to his music and were mortified by what had happened. They'd offered him coffee, a quiet room to decompress, anything he needed. He politely declined, thanked them for their kindness, and headed to his car. Sitting in the back seat as his driver navigated through London traffic, Paul looked out the window at the city he'd known for so many decades. He felt tired, not from the confrontation, but from the reminder that even after all these years, even after all he'd accomplished, there were still people who felt the need to tear him down. But he also felt something else. Relief. Relief that he'd stood up for himself, that he hadn't just sat there and taken the abuse. Relief that he'd recognized the situation for what it was and removed himself from it. There was dignity in that, he thought. There was strength in knowing when to walk away. His phone buzzed with messages, his manager, his publicist, friends who'd already heard what happened. The story was spreading fast, just as the producer had predicted. But Paul wasn't worried. He knew the truth of what had happened in that studio. He knew that anyone who watched the footage, if it ever got released, would see exactly who had been unreasonable. "You all right, Paul?" his driver asked, catching his eye in the rearview mirror. "Yeah," Paul said, managing a small smile. "I'm all right. Just another day in the life, I suppose." The driver chuckled. "I heard what happened. My sister works at the studio. She said you were a complete gentleman." "I tried to be," Paul said. "Though I'll admit I lost my temper a bit at the end there." "Sounds like she deserved it," the driver said. "Begging your pardon for saying so, but she did." Paul didn't respond to that. He didn't want to badmouth Lorraine, even after everything. It wasn't in his nature. Instead, he thought about the documentary, the reason he'd agreed to the interview in the first place. It was a celebration of music, of collaboration, of the joy that creating art had brought to his life. That was what mattered. Not one hostile interview with one television host who'd let her own issues cloud her judgment. Back at the studio, Lorraine was sitting in a conference room facing 3 network executives. Their expressions were grim. "Do you understand the gravity of what happened today?" one of them asked. Lorraine nodded, her earlier defiance completely gone. "I do. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" another executive repeated. "You verbally attacked one of the most beloved musicians in the world on live television. Our phones haven't stopped ringing. Social media is exploding. This isn't just a mistake, Lorraine. This is a disaster." "I know," Lorraine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what came over me. I just kept pushing and pushing, and I couldn't seem to stop myself." The third executive leaned forward. "We need to know why. Why Paul McCartney? Why today? What were you hoping to achieve?" Lorraine thought about the question. What had she been hoping to achieve? "I think I wanted to prove I was still relevant," she admitted. "That I could create moments that people would talk about. But I went about it completely the wrong way." "Yes, you did," the first executive said. "And now we have to decide what to do about it." The room fell silent. Lorraine felt tears prickling at her eyes but refused to let them fall. She'd created this mess. She had to face the consequences with whatever dignity she had left. "We're suspending the show," the second executive said finally. "We need time to assess the damage, to figure out if there's any way to salvage this situation." "And me?" Lorraine asked, though she already knew the answer. "We'll be in touch," the third executive said, which was corporate speak for your career here is over. "We just need to work out the details." Lorraine stood on shaky legs. "For what it's worth, I am truly sorry. Not just for the damage to the network, but for how I treated Mr. McCartney. He deserved better." The executives didn't respond. Lorraine left the room, walked through the hallways of the building where she'd worked for so many years, and stepped out into the afternoon sunshine. She felt numb, disconnected from reality. How had it all gone so wrong so quickly? The answer, she knew, was that it hadn't been quick at all. It had been building for a while. This need to be more than she was. To create controversy where none existed. To mistake aggression for assertiveness. She'd let her insecurities drive her behavior. And now she was paying the price. Across town, Paul McCartney was in his home studio. Guitar in hand. Music had always been his refuge, his way of processing the world. His fingers found familiar chords and he began to play. Not thinking about the interview, not thinking about Lorraine Kelly, just letting the music flow through him the way it always had. This was who he was. Not the target of someone's misplaced anger. Not a has been clinging to past glory, but a musician who'd spent his entire life creating beauty and sharing it with the world. That was his legacy. That was what mattered. And no one, no matter how hard they tried, could take that away from him. As evening fell over London, 2 very different people contemplated the same event from very different perspectives. One had stood firm in the face of cruelty and walked away with his dignity intact. The other had let her worst impulses control her and lost everything she'd worked for in 39 seconds of pure contempt. It was a reminder that words have power, that how we treat others matters, and that sometimes the person we hurt most with our cruelty is ourselves. Lorraine Kelly had learned that lesson the hard way, in front of cameras and witnesses, with no way to take back what she'd said or undo what she'd done. All she could do now was live with the consequences and hope that someday, somehow, she might find a way to make amends. But Paul McCartney didn't need her amends. He had his music, his family, his fans, and a lifetime of memories that no interview could diminish. He'd faced far greater challenges than one hostile television host and come through them all. This was just another bump in a very long road. And like all the others, he'd move past it and keep creating, keep playing, keep being exactly who he'd always been. A musician, an artist, a legend.